if you think about it, 50 years ago, the life expectancy of a firm in the Fortune 500 was around 75 years. Well, today, that is less than 15 years, and it's declining all the time. You're willing to experiment, but you also want to do that in a disciplined way.
So what would be those types of innovation strategies?
It's always a good time to talk about innovation.
Hello everyone, my name is Christian Moldenhauer. Welcome. I'm Managing Director of Europe's fastest growing consulting network, Expert Powerhouse. At Expert Powerhouse, we are helping teams all over the world with on-demand consultants for their projects. And it's my real pleasure today to kick off the third episode of our EPH Talk series. Today, we're going to speak about innovation. And of course, that's a topic that does not seem to lose any relevance. And we've seen a tremendous amount of corporate companies that went out and started innovation labs, incubators, and other innovation centers around the world. Many of them have been shut down since then. And the question is why? Why is it so hard for corporations to innovate? And how can corporate companies overcome the barriers basically to innovation? I'm very excited today to have with us Roberto Croci, partner at Elysium Ventures. He is former managing director at Microsoft for startups in the Middle East. Roberto is also UAE Senator of the World Business Angels Investment Forum, and he has worked for Google for almost 10 years. He is an investor, board member at numerous companies, and therefore he's the best partner really to answer our questions around innovation today. Roberto, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Christian. Thank you for the kind introduction and the kind words. But it's really a true pleasure. Thank you for the invite and looking forward to our conversation today around innovation. As you said, it's always a good time, right? So to look into innovation. So we will probably talk about that. But I'm really keen and excited about our conversation today.
Yes, likewise. Roberto, from where are we seeing you today?
I'm based in Dubai, in sunny and let's say it's still very hot here, but it's getting better. We have two seasons down here, the very hot season and the other season, which is still hot, but not very hot. So we are entering that season, so it's getting better. But yeah, Dubai is also, has been doing great things lately, even also around innovation. So it's a great place to be right now if you look at what's happening in the world globally. So I'm enjoying the time here. I'm living here since almost 8 years now, and I'm still excited about the opportunity we see in this part of the world as well.
Really great. So if it's so hot, let's jump into the cold water maybe together.
Yeah, let's do it.
And as many corporate companies are busy fighting fires at the moment, since one crisis seems to follow another. Is there even time to innovate for those companies?
Well, look, this is a great question, because if you think about it, 50 years ago, the life expectancy of a firm in the Fortune 500 was around 75 years. Well, today, that is less than 15 years, and it's declining all the time, right? So there have been companies that historically, they didn't see the shift happening in the market. So they didn't see it coming. And they were not able to put in place or to have what was needed, to shift when they realized it, even if it was late, to shift it quickly. So those companies either disappeared or they were not able to survive. Whereas other companies have been able to build an organization and a model that was able to sustain them, even if they completely changed their business model. If you remember what Nokia in the early days was doing and what they ended up doing, but also other companies, think about Lego, think about Philips, and many others. So there is a plethora of companies that completely changed their business model, and even they went into a completely different industry. But because they saw the market shift and they were able to build an organization that sustained and was enabling them to make those changes. So if you ask me, I wouldn't make my answer dependent on the recent fact that we've been living so altogether, from the pandemic to the climate, to the war, and then whatever we are living as a society, because there have been in history, situations where crises and other situations where there have been market shifts, there have been downturns, there have been bubbles that we have been all living. To me, and in my experience and what I have learned as well, is there are certain organizations that have been successful in building their own organization as capable of doing innovation and adapting to times, or even anticipating the times and the market shifts, and other organizations that for different reasons have not been able to do so. So for me, what we said when we started, it's always a good time to talk about innovation because it's always important. We need to talk about what is the innovation strategy and what type of innovation as well.
Mhm. And you mentioned some examples already. So, what would be those types of innovation strategies or elements, speaking more broadly, what those companies did probably better than the ones that failed or that basically kept them also going on for longer than, I understand, 15 years is the average halftime now of a company?
Yeah, I think there is one thing is the success syndrome. So a lot of organizations, they find their fit with the market and they achieve success. And then they expand in size and of course they age. When that happens, usually there's sort of a inertia mechanism that is either structural or cultural. So maybe they are successful in stable markets, but then they fail, for example, when the markets shift, right? So why innovation initiatives fail? I think because ultimately organizations fail at three different things. One is having a clear innovation strategy. And when I say a clear innovation strategy, it's not just the high level, McKinsey or BCG PowerPoint on what should be the innovation strategy, but also specific to the point that the organization knows what kinds of innovation should the organization pursue. The second element is the innovation system. So as we have heard many times, strategy is also execution. So what is the innovation system? What capabilities the organization need to execute the strategy that they put in place? And finally, the third element is culture. So how the organization is able to build and embed an innovation culture, what behaviors the organization needs to enable the system that execute the strategy. And to be very concrete, when we talk about the strategy, for example, people tend to think that when we talk about innovation, they tend to think that we are talking about breakthrough innovation. So the next vaccine or a new device, whatever it's breakthrough. But innovation is also something that is not that obvious. For example, when someone came with the idea of putting the lettuce into a plastic bag and sell it like that, is that innovation? Yes, that's also innovation, because that innovation ended up to have a 30% increase in lettuce sales, globally, because it was possible, right? So that was innovation. And some innovation are also not about technology at all. So today we tend, because of the technology and all the changes we see in technology and the pace of those changes, we tend to think innovation always somehow related about tech, but sometimes it's not tech related. Think about, I don't know, Netflix, IKEA, Ryanair, Amazon Prime. So those are more business model innovation, right? So when we talk about organizations having an innovation strategy, in my opinion, what should happen is that the organization have a clarity of a framework, right? So mapping which innovation initiatives are core for the organization to pursue. And one framework I'm familiar with is this quadrant, where on one axis you have the fit with existing business models. So whether it's leveraging an existing business model or expanding or building a new business model, and the fit with existing technical competencies, whether it's, again, leveraging existing competencies or requiring new competencies. So if you imagine this quadrant, if you're talking about existing competencies and existing business model, this is more the routine, but still 90% of innovation happen in this quadrant. Even in organizations that are admired as the most innovative companies in the world, I've been years at Google. 90% of the innovation at Google, forget about the self-driving cars, Loon, the balloons, etc. But 90% of innovation was still happening in the core of the business, which was the search algorithm, right? So to exploit the core business, because there was still a lot to exploit there. And that's good, that's great. At the same time, when the organization what they struggle with is to explore around the routine, to explore whether to expand existing technical competencies in new business models, or to expand existing business models with new technical competencies, or to do both with a more architectural sort of innovation. So just to make it very clear and to give some examples, in the routine, we mentioned already the example of expanding, for example, keep developing the search algorithm, which is a routine sort of innovation, but is very clear. When we talk about, for example, leveraging existing tech competencies but expanding business models, think about the ride-sharing services. So the technology capability were already there, but they expanded into a new business model, which was the ride-sharing for the taxis, the Uber, the Lyft of the world, or open source software for software companies. The software capabilities were there. It was a new business model. When we talk about same business model but new tech competencies, we talk more about radical innovation. Think about biotechnology for pharma companies. Think about vehicles for auto companies. So they have the business model, but they expand it to new technology. And then we have the architectural ones, which is more doing everything at the same time. So new tech, new business model, like, I don't know, think about personalized medicine for pharma companies again, or digital imaging for companies like it could be being Kodak or Polaroid, right? So now the thing is, not many organizations put all of this into a framework, into a map, and decide and consciously say and prioritize in the routine quadrant, these are our big bets, our must-win battles. And meanwhile, we exploit the core business, we explore the disruptive, the architectural, the radical quadrant with these key initiatives that are being prioritized. So that's what I mean is when innovation initiative fails, is because the strategy is not declined or is not specific enough to a point where there is a framework leverage to be intentional and specific on which initiatives are prioritized and why. Because at the end of the day, what we said before, the organizations that we said were successful in doing so, they have a point in common, which is they've been able to become what would be called ambidextrous organizations, organizations that have been able to keep exploiting the core business while exploring the new innovation and mapping them intentionally to pursue results and success within those initiatives.
And Roberto, so I find it super interesting. You say there are those different quadrants. I mean, there is also like all sorts of other frameworks like Horizon 1, 2, and 3, which I think is also defending the core, thinking a bit around like what you can do in the core business, but then also what's the breakthrough that you want to go after. And I understand you saying you need to have basically a bit of everything, but you need to be clear on where also you allocate and which ones do you prioritize. Now, does a company have to do all of this by themselves? So I'm thinking from, if I would be an executive from a large company, are there any ways maybe to tap into startups you mentioned, building some ecosystem where all those breakthrough things can be done in a much more efficient way, or also collaboration can play a vital role?
Yeah, Christian, this is a wonderful question because in my opinion, there are two transformations that needs to happen. One is internal within the organization, of course, because in order to build the exploration of new initiatives and being intentional in that, it's not enough to build a separate department and call it innovation department and good luck, even if you give them a budget, because usually those are the things that get cut when things get rough. And so there should be an alignment. So there should be senior leadership involvement that is, and somehow that side initiative of exploration should be tied to the core in smart and in a good way. So internally, the organization definitely needs to transform to enable this change, but also externally, right? As you said, the most successful organizations are ones that have been able to reinterpret, reimagine their partnership, looking at building ecosystems, because chances are, even if you are within a company like Google, even the CEO of Google, the CEO of Microsoft, they don't necessarily know exactly all the things that are happening within their companies because the pace of innovation, the pace of development is too fast. There are so many things happening, right? So imagine within an organization, all of that. So, and chances are that also the competencies, you might not have all the required competencies in-house in order to build that, right? So if a startup, for example, come in with a solution that you can integrate into your existing products and services, then why reinventing the wheel, for example? Or if there is a partner that can add to your business model in a way that accelerates your go-to-market, why not leveraging that in a smart way? So definitely, as you were suggesting, and I totally agree with that, beyond the internal transformation that needs to happen within an organization in terms of culture, building the system after there is a clear strategy in place, there is also this opening to the external world, which has to be managed. Again, it has to be intentional. How do you build partnership? Who can be the right partner to sustain and to achieve the goals that the strategy and the system have been the direction that the company decided to through? And usually that comes through partnership. And partnership, one category you mentioned, startups, that could be one of the way an organization can explore doing innovation with, not necessarily the only way.
Super interesting. Yeah. So, and I mean, we're getting a bit into innovation ecosystems here. So before we continue, could you briefly describe from your perspective, what is an innovation ecosystem?
Yeah, look, that's a great question because to me, an ecosystem is when different stakeholders, different players come together and they make it like when we say the sum is greater than the parts, right? So an ecosystem thrives when there is a sharing of knowledge, when there is abundance and generosity of spirit and abundance of ideas that circulate. So within that abundance, basically you're able to build a funnel. So you have a natural selection of things that will converge because there is a lot of going on. Now, it seems like a chaotic description of something that happens randomly, but to me, some players like government, for example, and I can tell you from this part of the world, the ecosystem, for example, are mainly driven by government because they're at a stage where in history where they're shifting their economy from oil to knowledge base. So they're intentionally changing policies and regulations and laws to force these ecosystems to be created quickly, faster than what has been created in more mature ecosystems. But in general, I would say, to me, an innovation ecosystem is when there is knowledge sharing and cross-disciplinary interactions between different players that could include government, academia, private sector, public sector, corporates, startups, investors. Money, of course, is important driver. So VCs, family offices, investors, corporates, of course. And when these ecosystem players like incubators, accelerators, community hubs, so policymakers, etc. So when these constituents come together and there is ease of access to information, access to these players, collaboration, and when there is a sort of a giving of that before the taking, right? So the ecosystem gets created and it grows. Then, of course, in order to grow the ecosystem, there are some enabling factor and success factor, like the quantity of things, like let's say the quantity of startups, for example, the quantity of ideas is an enabling factor. So, but then at some point, the success factor is also, are we able to have enough money to get this going? Are we able to the quality out of this? So because as we said, it's not just a random chaotic happenings. It should then converge towards business value, so tangible value. So to me, an ecosystem gets formed with abundance, with quantity, with players that are there to give and collaborate and share, but then converge towards more business value, quality, and money that drives the value.
And so thanks for that definition. It's of course broad because the term is broad. Thinking a bit more in terms of from a company perspective, if I put myself in the shoes of, let's say, not a super large company executive, but let's say also the small and medium enterprises, how should I best tackle this? Should I strive to become part of an ecosystem? Should I try to build one myself? Should I set up an incubator myself? How is the best way basically for small and medium enterprises also to innovate?
Yeah, look, that's another great question. So I would say the vehicle or the how to really heavily depends on what are the objectives. For example, is my objective when I look at innovation pure diversification? Is my objective when I look at innovation pure investment? Is my objective a reimagination or reimagining the business model and reinventing the business model because of businesses, you see the market shifts, you see this and that. So I think the clarity on what the objectives are, and maybe it's a combination of all of these at the same time, but the clarity on that drives also the how to an organization can go to market with innovation, because there could be different models, as you said. So one model could be the organization might double down on R&D and might be good enough to achieve the objectives that the organization has to drive innovation. The other model could be that the organization is more geared towards an M&A model. So because that would be the solution to the objectives that the organization set. And maybe the vehicle is something in the middle, which is building an ecosystem of engagement with innovation, like startups, for example, that still help the organization to achieve their goals. So it really depends on what the objectives are. And then also, I think it's a matter for the organization to balance what is the timing, the risk, and the cost of the innovation efforts. So because if an organization is more into R&D, usually timing is more a longer term thing. The risk is higher because you are really into trying to research and developing something new, and the cost usually is also high. Whereas with an M&A model, usually we're talking about a much shorter period of time with lower risk, because you say, oh, let me source in the market what is available, what we can integrate, acquire, merge, and build on that. And the cost might still be relatively high. Whereas could be a model in the middle where, especially if you are a small, medium business, maybe you are looking into, can I tap or can I build an ecosystem myself? So maybe my timing is medium term. Maybe I don't have that appetite for a high risk, but I also am an average sort of risk taker. And the cost that I have still is not as high as I would do an M&A or R&D. So it's lower, right? So I need to be more, I need to be leaner. I need to be smoother, more efficient. And in that case, maybe an engagement with startups could be also the easier way to start with. So to your question, I believe there is no one single answer to your question. It depends on the objectives. And it's also a matter of speed. So because in this new world, what we are learning is that is not the big fish which eats the small fish as it used to happen in the past, but it's probably the faster fish that eats the slower fish. So it's the speed at which these initiatives are also executed and embedded into the organization might also make a difference. And that might also be the source of competitive advantage versus your competition. So again, it's a matter of balancing these drivers, in my opinion.
So you mentioned speed there, which I find super interesting because companies also, of course, many companies we see trying to become more agile, plug and play basically different solutions to enlarge their value proposition. And so my question would be, we're now talking a lot about ecosystems, how to externalize. Do you see any examples where companies maybe completely outsourced their innovation?
I can give you a few examples. Let me use one company that is regional here, but is global because everybody knows the brand, and one that is in Germany. So I think it will resonate as well with the audience. One is Emirates. They are building innovation basically through a consortium so they built a partnership with other relevant players, including, for example, the Dubai tourism, which of course travel is very much related also to hospitality and airlines, but also players like Accenture as a system integrator, Microsoft as a big tech player, Amadeus as an industry focused player. So putting together these big players around the same table, Emirates built something called Intellect Hub, which is a hub where they are developing innovation through startups. It's Emirates, but it's also outside of Emirates through partnerships with other corporates and with different phases. So within Intellect Hub, for example, there is a focus on earlier stage startups. So there is more tolerance to longer timing to wait for that innovation to materialize, but there is also a focus on growth stage startups that might be directly integratable within, for example, Emirates systems. And there is also a focus on the moonshots. So, for example, one project that they are doing is rethinking the airport of the future. So not only in terms of safety with all the COVID and pandemic that we experienced, but really rethinking the experience and the airport of the future holistically. So this is an example, right? So it's a big company that to be very honest, in this part of the world, they don't have much competition. So if you live in Dubai, you go with Emirates, right? And they're doing amazing. So the transit that you have in the Dubai airport is probably still, if not the best in the world, but one of the top three. But still, they are investing into innovation to be careful about how the experience for customers is shifting, what new innovation is coming from there at different stages. And they're doing that in partnership with external corporates. Non-competitive, of course, but they are complementary to what an Emirates can put on the table. Imagine you are a founder or a startup that are into that industry. If you can tap into an hub where you have Emirates, Dubai Tourism, Accenture, Microsoft, and Amadeus, well, you're done in the sense that if you can test deploy your solution, and then you can commercialize it even broader and globally, right? So there is a global resonance. I think this is a great example of how a company with clear ideas on their innovation and execution, they can drive that forward in a specific industry or sector. Another company I had the pleasure and the privilege to work with around some of their initiatives is Bosch in Germany. And they built an internal program as well for example, because a lot of employees develop the best knowledge. Your employees develop the best knowledge about your company because they know the business model inside out, they know the challenges, they know the customer feedback. So, but a lot of employees at some point, they might end up leaving the company and that lives with them, right? So why not investing as well in programs that can enable employees as well to capitalize the ideas that they might have, of course, selecting the ones that are more relevant in terms of having an impact on the business, and allow them to give it a try. So to try to take that idea to the next stage of development, to a prototype, to make it more concrete and test it out. And to be honest, other companies had similar approach. For example, at Google, there was this Area 120, right, project where you as an employee, you could have submitted an idea and there was a committee with a clear investment thesis where if your idea got selected, then you could have worked on that for a year time and you could have tried to develop that as a business. Then if it failed, you could go back to your previous job. You were still an employee with the company, but you were given that if you were selected. So again, according to a specific criteria and thesis. Now, the details of these programs, of course, depends on the size of the organization, on the capabilities, etc., and the culture. But this is another example of a large organization I've been working with has been doing something really concrete and different around innovation for their employees.
And I'm super thankful for you bringing up that example because I would have also asked, like we talked about a lot external, what can you do internally to bring all those ideas of the employees that might be there and of course that you want to bring up because it's good for the company, but it's also a great purpose for the employees if they can basically realize what they have in mind.
To complement that answer and to your point that you just made, I think it's important as well to mention there is no free meal because you can say, oh, it's easy to say, you can allow your employee to be creative and share their ideas and work on their ideas. But of course, everything comes to a cost. So to me, there are two things here. One is this should be driven as well by the business value that those ideas will contribute and create to the business, of course. The other thing is building the right culture within the organization, which should be, everybody thinks about innovation, think about creativity only. So everybody talks about tolerance for failure, this willingness to experiment, the psychological safety, so everybody can bring their own self to the environment of work, collaboration, flat organization, all is nice, but everybody wants that. But the thing is, to build an innovation culture, that's not enough, because at some point you need to converge that creativity to a sort of a discipline where, yes, you are tolerant for failure, but you are also not tolerant for incompetence. You are willing to experiment, but you want to do that in a disciplined way. You want psychological safety, but you also want to give brutally candid feedback when something doesn't make sense. So you want collaboration, but you also want individual accountability. You want a flat organization, but you also want to have a strong leadership. So it should be a balance. When we talk about building a culture of innovation, should be a balance between creativity and discipline to make it real. So it's not just the creativity angle, that wouldn't be enough.
I completely agree. And being a bit conscious, I think we could go on for 1 more hour easily. But of course, I encourage also everyone, if there are questions, please put them in the chat, so we can have them for our Q&A following. So Roberto, if you think about 2 or 3 things, and you've just mentioned the culture needs to be right, there needs to be a strategy, what would be the 2 or 3 tips that you would give for executives that they need to keep in mind, and also to make sure that enough is being done with regards to innovation in the company?
Yeah, one is innovation is not something that should be built in isolation. So the software side of innovation is more important than the hardware side of innovation. And what I mean with software is the organization structure. We've seen many times, and I've seen myself many times, innovation initiatives fail because innovation was either confined to a department that was not aligned with the rest of the organization, where there was not the right alignment in terms of culture, but also really organizational alignment to make sure that innovation was really aligned with this and driving concrete initiative forward. So that's one thing. The second thing is definitely, as we mentioned, building the right culture of innovation, which is, building this culture of experimentation. If you don't change the way you make decisions, and if you don't build experimentation and you maybe make decisions based on experimentation, based on data or based on insights, everything remains a little bit theoretic, so at a very surface or high level. So embedding this into the organization means as well, it's a transformation project. It requires some time. So alongside with the organizational capabilities to build and to change, it's also the culture and the culture of experimentation that needs to be built. The other thing is really being very clear on what the strategy is, which is not just the high level titles or the direction or, the buzzwords, the hype of technology or whatever, is mapping out what concrete initiatives make sense, using whatever framework. At the end of the day, it's not the framework that, there are very solid, valid frameworks out there, but being very specific and intentional on what initiatives are making that strategy into execution, and what are the measure of success, what are the KPIs that you want to see happening to have those initiatives being driven within the organization. Within the organization, as we said before, internally, but also through external partners. So clarifying as well the approach to market, which is where you want to play. Is it again an R&D game? Is it an M&A game? Is it more an ecosystem game? Is a combination of those? Again, having clarity on which initiatives will also help clarify a lot of the questions that come when you start executing it.
And now you made me very curious, and I will just take 1 or 2 more minutes. But when you want to set this clarity, of course, most executives I know they can make individual decisions. How do you basically get this clarity? Do you start with a joint workshop to discuss that? Or how do you best approach such a transformation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I believe, yes, there should be alignment from the senior leadership team within the organization, whether they are then ultimately responsible of that or they are enablers of that. There should be an alignment happening there. That's what I called before the softer side of it. So the more soft thing, there should be an alignment there in order to make sure that, whatever is run as under the exploration side of things is tied to the exploitation side of things. So this ambidextrous organization is not that the two sides are disjointed or they're not aligned to each other. So, and that happens if there is a top-down leadership. It starts from the leaders of the organization to buy into that and to show the behaviors as well on that, and also to reward the efforts and the actions on those initiatives accordingly. So sometimes it sounds super straightforward, but sometimes in a lot of organizations, those are things that don't get implemented. So really it becomes really an isolated effort of good luck, guys. So these are the guys that have been shipped on that boat, and good luck if they find the next breakthrough thing, and we will hear from them in 5 years from now. And then it doesn't happen that way. It should be aligned at all levels, starting from leadership in terms of the performance management, what are the KPIs, and all. So that requires some time. That requires, of course, the vision from the CEO on the top, to wanting to make this happen, to embed this into his leadership team. So I think it starts there. It starts there because, of course, in parallel, there are organizations where there is the bottom up. So where a couple of engineers sit together in a canteen during a lunch and they decide to build Gmail. And that's how Gmail happened, right? So that's fine. Either you create those situations intentionally and those are part of the culture. But again, it's a leadership decision to build an organization like that. So to me, if you ask me, it's something that should start at the very top. Also because if you look at the numbers, I have some stats to share. For example, if I'm not mistaken, it was 68% of the top 100 companies from Forbes Global 500 are engaging with startups. And the majority of unicorns, again, more than 60%, have raised from at least one corporate, not including investment firms or banks. So the corporations, these are just two indicative numbers that show how corporations are sort of embedded or involved into this ecosystem and into this conversation. So to me, it's a matter of strong alignment at the leadership level, building the soft of the innovation side of things, and making sure that the organization has a commitment, right? So at that level to drive it forward with clarity of intentions that come top down.
Great. Thanks so much for these insights, Roberto. With regards to time, I would basically also open up now for questions, as we've been talking for quite a while and it's been super interesting. So if there are any questions, I would encourage everyone basically to post comments also, or questions that you might have. Previous to our discussions, we received also some questions. So I probably started off with one of these questions, which was around that connection between startups and corporates. So looking at the startup perspective, how do you think startups are doing? Are they approaching corporates in the right way? What are they struggling with and what could they do better?
Yeah, that's a great question, because from my experience, for corporates to identify which challenges they have in the different units or departments, that's not the tough thing. For corporates to find a startup that can solve for those challenges is also not the hard thing. There is a lot of startups out there with a lot of great solutions, right? So the real challenge, or where startups, if we take the startup perspective now, where startups are still struggling into this equation, is when the execution starts. So when a startup starts working with a corporate, is when usually most things fall apart. Is usually startup would assume certain things that it's not the way corporate. So starting from the very basics of, I thought I was assuming I got access to that data, and that data is not given access to the startup, so it becomes a roadblock, a wall that they are hitting. Procurement, NDAs, sponsorship, having the right sponsors, navigating the organization, the sales cycle, selling within the enterprise, the sequence of events that should happen in order for them to. So there is a number of things that a lot of startups give for granted because maybe they don't have the experience. But when they start that work, there is also a clash between the culture, right? So usually a big corporation has certain processes, certain compliance things in place that they need. The startup usually is more agile. So, but the thing is, when these two entities start working together, usually there is a clash there. And sometimes those founders that have no experience, because maybe it's the first time founders, first time startups, and first time working with a corporate, then they are hitting a lot of walls because they don't know how to move those things forward. So they're kind of learning on the way. And we know, whoever has worked within corporates or consulting corporates for a long time, you know how difficult it is to drive certain things forward, again, if it is a matter of speed. For me, if you ask me, most of the times the real issues usually lies with execution from a startup perspective, but also from a corporate perspective, and lies in all of those details that of execution that a startup is not prepared for, unless their founders, as a serious or extensive corporate background, is prepared for that, has enough connections at the right level to open all the doors, etc., etc. But most of the times we see that's not the case, and that's where startups are struggling, because it's a clash of culture, it's a clash of lack of experience, is a lack of knowledge, information, is a lack of thinking before, ahead of time, and many things. Different speed is different way of executing things, is different decision making. So that makes it very difficult in executing.
Thank you. Maybe jumping to the next question here. Yeah. If I want to set up an innovation program or lab, what are the key elements that I need to consider?
Yeah, look, again, that's a great question. So I would say the first element, I would say it's straightforward, but is what are the objectives with the Innovation Lab? So it has to be super clear. I'll give you an example. So a lot of those programs fail because it's not clear what's in it for the startups and the corporate running that lab. So again, is it for a business development? Is it for a diversification? Is it to reimagine a specific business model? Is it very focused on a specific aspect of the business? Is it for a pure investment, et cetera, et cetera? So that needs to be clear. Also, it needs to be clear the extent of support and commitment that the corporate is putting on the table through the Innovation Lab, which what's the commitment there? And then what's the scope of the program of the lab? Is it a readiness program? So is it onboarding a number of startups to make them ready for something? And that's a phase one of a lab that has also a phase two? Or is it, a commercialization program? So taking startups that are more ready and taking them to commercialization. So there are many, many aspects there. But I would say one is clarity on the objectives of what the program should drive and clarity on what is the measure of success. And the two things, of course, are intertwined. Then, as usual, there are always multiple ways of doing the same things, right? So, for example, for a long time, we have seen labs that have been working across a very prescriptive type of programs, like cohorts with, 12 weeks. Every week, there is a sort of a flow of things to happen. And we have seen more recently, that those kind of programs have become more flexible or relaxed because a lot of the startups come in, they can get most of that information elsewhere or even online. So what they really need is the more practical things of, hey, I'm working with a corporate, so can we take this idea to the next stage? What's the next stage? Is it the commercialization? Is it readiness? Is it, that needs to be mapped. So those programs are gradually, most of them are shaping towards something more open, less prescriptive, more integrated into the business, and more hands-on in terms of that integrations. So, but usually those are the things that you would start from keeping in mind when you start designing or thinking about an innovation lab.
There was one more probably related to that. How do you measure the success of innovation? So when do you know to basically let go a startup or let fail an idea? What's a good review cycle time?
Wow, that's a big question in the sense that, again, I don't want to give you a consulting answer, it depends. But when you look at the success of it, again, first, it ties with the objectives that you have. But second is also on the stage, it is as if you are thinking as an investor. So as an investor, would you put a chip, would you put a bit into that startup? Yes, no, why? At the early stage, really, it's a finger in the air, right? So you don't really know. What you're really betting on is on the quality of the founding team. Maybe as a corporate, now declining more into a corporate sort of scenario, usually you get in touch with the founding team that has serious experience or a strong hook or tie or passion within that industry, that segment, that vertical, whatever. And then, of course, they're trying to solve a real problem that you also see. And then you bet on them. So you see if there is commitment, quality of those founders to be there no matter what to solve for that problem. At the later stages, of course, it becomes less, there is less risk on that, but it's more on how that solution can really integrate. And usually the solution, the measure of success usually at that stage is more, that solution is going to be integrated into an existing business to solve a specific problem. So, and you might already have the stats or the numbers or the KPIs or the OKRs of why that is a problem. So what is that is not working there? So usually the measure of success is how effectively that solution is turning those numbers into a success story. Because at the end of the day, you're integrating a solution to solve specific problems that your business is facing or to improve certain specific business metrics to drive the value of the business. So this is still, I know it's very high level, so probably it would be more specific if you have a concrete example, we go deep dive. But in general, those are the things. So to me, it's a big factor is whether it's an early stage or growth stage startups. The thing is, should be an investor mindset in terms of how you look at things. And then it's very tied to your own business metrics, because in this case, we're talking about startups working with a corporate that to solve a specific problem. So what are the metrics not working there and how that solution can add value to the business?
Thank you. And I think with that, we're also almost a little bit over time. So once again, Roberto, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time. For me, it was super interesting. I think we learned a lot about innovation and organization being very clear about the objectives. That is one thing that came out for me multiple times. Thank you a lot for joining us today. Of course, I would say let's keep in touch because it's a topic we cannot talk about it enough. And of course, everyone, I'd like to invite you to follow our Expert Powerhouse LinkedIn page for future events that will be up also in a couple of weeks. So don't miss out on that. Roberto, once again, thanks for joining us today. Everyone, I wish you a great and successful day. Take care and see you soon.
Thank you so much, Christian. Thank you, everyone attending. Just a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.